Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of New Mexico. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1887. Santa Fe, already ancient by American standards, stood as a dusty crossroads where Spanish colonial influence met the untamed spirit of the frontier. The railroad had arrived just 7 years prior, bringing with it an influx of settlers, opportunists, and those seeking to escape their past. Among them was a man who would come to be known in hushed whispers as Reverend Silas Thorne. Winter winds swept across the high desert that December, carrying with them the scent of pinon smoke and the promise of a harsh season. The territorial capital was adorned with traditional luminarias, their warm glow a stark contrast to the darkness that had begun to take root at the edge of town. It was there, in a modest adobe church, that Thorne had established his ministry just 18 months earlier. The building stood in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, whose name, Blood of Christ, would prove unnervingly prophetic. County records show that Thorne arrived in Santa Fe in July of 1886, though investigations years later would reveal discrepancies in his documented history. According to the Santa Fe New Mexican newspaper archives, he presented letters of recommendation from a parish in Missouri. Yet when researchers in 1963 attempted to locate these records, they found no evidence of his presence there. The first mystery of many. The Missouri town from which Thorne claimed to have come, Blackwater, did exist, but the church he named St. Bartholomew's did not appear in any diocesan records. When contacted by Santa Fe authorities in September 1887, the postmaster of Blackwater replied that no preacher matching Thorne's description had ever served the community. Furthermore, he noted that the town had experienced several unexplained disappearances in the months before Thorne's arrival in New Mexico. This correspondence, filed away and forgotten during the subsequent chaos, would not be rediscovered until 1953. The territorial governor's wife was said to be particularly taken with his sermons, which survivors later described as mesmerizing and unlike any gospel we had heard before. According to the private journals of Margaret Bradford, wife of Territorial Governor Edmund Bradford, Thorne possessed a voice that seems to reach inside you, touching places that mere words should not be able to reach. She described feeling a curious lightness after his services, as though something had been extracted and replaced with a profound calm. Margaret became one of Thorne's most ardent supporters, donating substantial sums from her personal inheritance to his ministry and encouraging her husband to do the same. What we do know with certainty is that Thorne quickly ingratiated himself with key members of the community. His church, while modest in appearance, soon attracted a devoted congregation. By all accounts, Reverend Thorne was a striking figure, tall and lean, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you. His black coat was always immaculate despite the dusty conditions, and he wore a silver cross that witnesses consistently described as unusually heavy and oddly shaped. Though no photographs of Thorne are known to exist, courthouse sketches from later proceedings suggest a man of intense presence, with hollow cheeks and a tight, controlled smile that never reached his eyes. Local silversmith Diego Ortega maintained a small workshop near the plaza, where he crafted jewelry and religious items for the community. In a statement given to Sheriff Conklin during the investigation, Ortega recalled Thorne commissioning several unusual pieces, including a set of silver cups with strange markings that were neither Spanish nor Indian, but something altogether different. Ortega claimed Thorne provided his own silver for these pieces, a peculiar dust-like form that the silversmith found difficult to work with. It did not melt like normal silver, he reported. It seemed almost alive in the fire, moving in ways I have never seen metal move before. The church register, partially preserved in the New Mexico State Archives, shows a congregation that grew from 12 members to over 60 in just 6 months. an impressive achievement in a town with competing Catholic and Protestant establishments. What drew people to this newcomer? According to journal entries from Martha Whitfield, wife of a local merchant, Reverend Thorne speaks of salvation not as a distant promise, but as something immediate and tangible. He claims to see into men's souls and know their burdens. After my first meeting with him, I felt as though a weight had been lifted. Martha's journal, discovered in 1925 by her granddaughter, provides one of the most comprehensive accounts of Thorne's early ministry. She describes his sermons as focusing heavily on themes of transformation and purification. The Reverend speaks often of silver as God's chosen metal, she wrote in September 1886. He tells us that just as silver must be refined by fire to remove its impurities, so too must the human soul be refined through suffering and sacrifice. Such testimonials were common. The territorial governor's quarterly report noted a marked improvement in public morality and credited the new preacher with helping to civilize certain elements of the community. Yet beneath this veneer of spiritual renewal, something far more disturbing was taking place. The first indication came in February of 1887, when a young ranch hand named Thomas Gideon disappeared after attending one of Thorne's private counseling sessions. According to statements given by his employer, James Rutledge, Gideon had been troubled by terrible nightmares and sought the Reverend's guidance. The Santa Fe Sheriff's Office recorded the disappearance, but conducted only a cursory investigation, concluding that Gideon had likely moved on to seek opportunities elsewhere, a common occurrence in the transient frontier population. Rutledge's testimony, documented in Sheriff Conklin's official report, described Gideon as a reliable worker who had been with the ranch for nearly 3 years. He wasn't the type to just up and leave, Rutledge stated, especially not without collecting his wages. Rutledge further noted that in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Gideon had become increasingly withdrawn and complained of feeling hollow inside. After attending several of Thorne's services, the young man claimed to have found a new purpose, but would not elaborate when pressed for details. What makes this case particularly unsettling is an entry in Rutledge's personal ledger, discovered decades later during renovation of his former property. The entry, dated February 19, 1887, reads, "Paid final wages to T.G. as instructed by Reverend Thorne. The sum to be donated to church building fund. T.G. has found his peace, according to the Reverend. May God grant it be so." Even more disturbing was a second entry, dated March 3rd, which noted, "Visited Reverend Thorne today. He presented me with a small silver token, said to contain a blessing from T.G. It feels strangely warm to the touch. The Reverend says I should wear it always as protection against evil. I find I cannot bring myself to remove it, even at night." Throughout the spring of 1887, 3 more individuals vanished after seeking counsel from Thorne. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern: troubled individuals, private meetings, and a subsequent explanation from the Reverend that they had moved on or found their calling elsewhere. In each case, personal effects were left behind, and in each case, local authorities accepted Thorne's explanations without significant inquiry. The second to disappear was Michael Donovan, a miner who had recently lost his wife to tuberculosis. According to testimony from his boarding house proprietor, Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan, Donovan had fallen into deep despair and turned to alcohol for solace. The Reverend took a special interest in Michael, Sullivan reported. He'd come by personally to collect him for services, which wasn't like the other preachers in town. After a few weeks, Michael seemed different, calmer, but somehow vacant, like he wasn't fully present. Donovan disappeared on March 15th. When questioned, Thorne explained that the man had decided to seek a fresh start in California. He produced a letter, purportedly from Donovan, thanking the congregation for their support and indicating he would not return. Handwriting analysis conducted in 1960 would conclude that the letter was not written by Donovan, based on comparison with mining claim documents bearing his signature. The third disappearance occurred on April 2nd. Jacob Weiss, a German immigrant who owned a small bookshop on San Francisco Street, failed to open his store one Monday morning. Neighbors reported having last seen him attending Thorne's Sunday service. A brief notice in the Santa Fe New Mexican on April 4th mentioned that Weiss had returned to his homeland due to family matters, citing Reverend Thorne as the source. Immigration records examined years later showed no evidence of Weiss departing the country. Felipe Montoya, brother of Elena, who would later raise concerns about Thorne, vanished on May 10th. As a member of a prominent Hispanic family with roots in the region dating back to Spanish colonial times, his disappearance created more questions than the others. The Montoya family was Catholic, and Felipe's attendance at a Protestant service had already caused tension. According to Elena's testimony, her brother had begun visiting Thorne's church in secret after claiming to have disturbing visions that traditional prayers could not dispel. By June, rumors had begun to circulate among the Hispanic population of Santa Fe. Elena Montoya, whose brother Felipe was among the missing, wrote in a letter to her cousin in Taos, "The Anglo authorities do nothing. Felipe would never leave without his medallion of San Miguel. The new preacher speaks smoothly, but his eyes are empty like a snake's. Grandmother says he brings the air of death with him, like the crows that circle before a storm." Elena's letter, preserved in the Taos Historical Society collection, goes on to describe increasingly strange behavior among those who attended Thorne's services regularly. Maria Gonzalez, who cleans for the Bradford family, says the governor's wife now wears a silver pendant that she never removes, even while bathing. When Maria asked about it, Mrs. Bradford spoke of carrying a piece of grace with her always. Her eyes have the same emptiness I saw in Felipe before he vanished. The Montoya family appealed directly to Father Sebastian Alvarez of San Miguel Mission, the oldest church in Santa Fe. According to church records, Father Alvarez visited Thorne's church under the pretense of ecumenical outreach. His report to the bishop, dated June 23, 1887, expressed grave concerns. "I found no crosses within, save those made of silver which the congregants wear. The altar bears strange symbols I have not encountered in my studies." During our conversation, the Reverend spoke of distilling the divine essence through what he termed the silver pathway. I believe this man may be practicing something far removed from Christian teaching. The territorial newspapers made no mention of these concerns. Instead, the Santa Fe New Mexican ran a glowing profile of Thorne in July 1887, highlighting his plans to expand the church and establish an orphanage on the property. The article noted that generous donations from prominent citizens had made these ambitions possible. County records confirm that Thorne purchased an additional 3 acres adjacent to the church that summer, including an abandoned silver mining operation that had played out years earlier. The article, penned by editor Thomas Hughes, described Thorne as a visionary bringing much-needed spiritual guidance to our growing community. It mentioned that Thorne's sermons had begun to attract visitors from as far away as Albuquerque and Las Vegas, New Mexico. Hughes wrote, "The Reverend speaks of a future where Santa Fe might become a center of spiritual enlightenment for the entire territory, drawing pilgrims seeking transformation and renewal." What the article failed to mention was that Hughes himself had become a devoted follower of Thorne. His personal diary, discovered among his effects after his death in 1902, revealed that he had begun wearing a silver amulet given to him by the preacher. The Reverend says it contains the essence of James Wheeler, who found peace through the silver pathway, Hughes wrote. "When I wear it, I can sometimes hear whispers that seem to come from within the silver itself." It was the mine that would later become central to the investigation. Mining records housed in the Territorial Survey Office described it as a shallow shaft of approximately 40 feet, with a single horizontal tunnel extending northward for 75 feet. Operations had ceased in 1881 when the vein proved unprofitable. What interest a preacher might have in such a property raised few questions at the time. Alexander Wilson, a mining engineer who had surveyed the property before its sale, later provided testimony that struck investigators as odd. The silver content was minimal by commercial standards, he stated, but Reverend Thorne seemed pleased by my report. He was particularly interested in the composition of what little silver was present, asking detailed questions about its purity and properties that I wouldn't expect from someone outside the mining profession. He mentioned something about it having receptive qualities that made it ideal for his purposes. Throughout July and early August, locals reported increased activity around the mine. Wagons were seen coming and going at odd hours, often late at night. When questioned by curious neighbors, Thorne explained that he was merely preparing the property for the planned orphanage, clearing out the old mining equipment and making the area safe. Few questioned this explanation, though some noted that the wagons often arrived empty and left covered with tarpaulins. August brought the disappearance that would finally trigger serious concern. Catherine Blackwood, the 19-year-old daughter of Judge William Blackwood, failed to return home after attending an evening service at Thorne's church. Unlike the previous cases, Catherine came from a prominent family with significant influence. Judge Blackwood immediately organized a search party and demanded a full investigation. Catherine was known throughout Santa Fe as a young woman of exceptional intelligence and artistic sensitivity. She had studied at a finishing school in Boston before returning to New Mexico, bringing with her progressive ideas and an interest in spiritualism that had become fashionable in Eastern circles. According to her father's statement, Catherine had been drawn to Thorne's church after hearing about his unique approach to spiritual matters. Judge Blackwood, himself a traditional Episcopalian, had disapproved, but allowed his daughter to attend, believing it to be a passing interest. According to sheriff's reports, when questioned, Thorne appeared genuinely concerned about Catherine's whereabouts. He claimed she had left the service early, appearing distressed, but he had not spoken with her privately that evening. This marked the first departure from the established pattern, and it raised immediate suspicions. Several congregants confirmed seeing Catherine leave before the service concluded. Mary Ellison, who sat near Catherine that evening, reported that the young woman had become visibly agitated during Thorne's sermon. She kept touching her throat and looking around as if she couldn't breathe, Ellison stated. When the Reverend began speaking about vessels worthy of transformation, she stood abruptly and hurried out. I noticed she left behind a silver brooch the Reverend had given to several of us women in the congregation. The search for Catherine Blackwood continued for 3 days without result. On the 4th day, a rancher found her horse wandering near the Pecos River, approximately 15 miles east of Santa Fe. The saddle was in place, but there was no sign of Catherine. The discovery shifted the search to the river and surrounding areas. The horse bore unusual markings that troubled the search party. According to the rancher's testimony, the animal had what appeared to be silver dust embedded in its mane and around its nostrils. More disturbing was a small silver object found secured to the saddle, a miniature cup similar to a communion chalice, intricately engraved with symbols that matched those described in Father Alvarez's report from Thorne's church. It was during this expanded search that Deputy Marshal Robert Hayes made a discovery that would alter the course of the investigation. While crossing Thorne's recently acquired property, Hayes noticed unusual activity around the entrance to the abandoned mine. Later testimony states that he observed fresh wagon tracks and what appeared to be a new wooden structure partially obscuring the mine entrance. Hayes, a veteran lawman who had served with the Texas Rangers before joining the Territorial Marshal's office, approached the mine cautiously. In his written statement, he described hearing a low humming sound, almost like singing but without distinguishable words, emanating from within. As he drew closer, the sound ceased abruptly. When he examined the mine entrance, he found the wooden door securely locked with a heavy iron padlock. When Hayes returned with Sheriff Thomas Conklin to investigate further, they found Reverend Thorne at the site. According to Hayes' official statement, Thorne explained he was converting the mine for storage purposes. When asked why he would need such a remote storage facility, Thorne reportedly became agitated and stated that the affairs of the church are not subject to secular authority. Sheriff Conklin, in his subsequent report, noted that Thorne's demeanor had shifted dramatically during this confrontation. While he has always presented himself as the very model of genteel composure, on this occasion the Reverend exhibited a coldness that bordered on threat, Conklin wrote. When I inquired about the sounds Deputy Hayes had reported, Thorne claimed it was merely the wind moving through the old mine shafts, though the day was notably still. This confrontation might have ended there had Catherine Blackwood not been the daughter of a territorial judge. Sheriff Conklin, acting under Judge Blackwood's authority, returned the following day with a search warrant for the entire property, including the mine. The search party consisted of Sheriff Conklin, Deputy Hayes, and 2 additional deputies, along with Judge Blackwood himself, who insisted on being present. According to multiple accounts, Thorne received them at the church with apparent resignation. "You will not understand what you find," he reportedly told them. Or, "Some transformations cannot be undone once begun." What they discovered in that abandoned silver mine would become the subject of whispered conversation throughout the territory for decades to come. The official report, sealed by territorial authorities until 1952, describes the scene in clinical terms that nonetheless convey horror. The main tunnel had been converted into what the report terms a chamber for ritualistic purposes. The walls were covered with biblical verses written in what testing later confirmed was human blood mixed with silver dust. Among the verses prominently displayed were several from the book of Malachi. "But who may abide the day of his coming, and who shall stand when he appeareth? For he is like a refiner's fire, and like fuller's soap. And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver." These were interspersed with passages that biblical scholars would later confirm did not appear in any known religious text, including references to the silver pathway between flesh and spirit, and vessels emptied to be filled with greater purpose. At the end of the tunnel, investigators discovered a crude altar carved from native stone. Behind this altar was a small alcove where they found personal effects belonging to 5 of the missing individuals, including Catherine Blackwood's silver locket containing a photograph of her mother. Each item had been carefully arranged and labeled with small silver plaques bearing the owner's name and what appeared to be a date. Thomas Gideon's pocket watch, Michael Donovan's wedding ring, Jacob Weiss's spectacles, Felipe Montoya's medallion of San Miguel, Catherine's locket. None showed signs of damage, but all had the same strange quality, a coating of fine silver dust that seemed to adhere to the surface despite attempts to wipe it away. The most disturbing discovery, however, was a leather-bound journal belonging to Thorne himself. The contents, partially transcribed in the sealed report, reveal a man consumed by a twisted theology of his own creation. In his writings, Thorne claimed to have discovered what he called the silver pathway, a means of harvesting human souls through a combination of silver, blood, and ritual sacrifice. The journal began conventionally enough, with entries dating back to 1881, when Thorne was apparently serving as an assistant to a silversmith in Philadelphia. Early passages described his fascination with the metal's properties, its purity, its reflective nature, its historical associations with spirituality across cultures. He noted experiments with different alloys and techniques, seemingly innocent research, until an entry dated November 1882 marked a disturbing shift. "Today I discovered something extraordinary," he wrote. "While working with E. on the communion vessels, I cut my hand deeply on the edge of a silver sheet. As my blood mixed with the liquefied silver, I experienced a vision of such clarity and power that I can no longer doubt the existence of the pathway. The silver absorbed not merely my blood, but something more essential. For several minutes afterward, I felt a curious emptiness, as though a part of me had been extracted. When the sensation passed, I found that the silver had hardened in a pattern unlike anything I had seen before, almost organic in its structure. He saw nothing unusual, but I know what I witnessed. The metal lives, it hungers. It can serve as a conduit between states of being. Subsequent entries documented Thorne's increasingly deliberate experiments, first with animals and eventually with human subjects. He wrote of volunteers who believed they were participating in spiritual cleansing rituals, unaware that Thorne was systematically extracting what he called their essence through carefully orchestrated ceremonies involving silver implements and their own freely given blood. One passage, dated April 1887, reads, "The essence flows like quicksilver when properly released, not at the moment of death, but in the exquisite space between life and surrender." Each vessel yields its treasure differently. Some require coaxing, others break too quickly. The rancher's boy was disappointing, too willing, no resistance. The miner fought and produced abundantly. I have collected 7 vessels now, 7 purified essences. The silver absorbs and preserves. The transformation nears completion. The final entries became increasingly incoherent, filled with references to the 7th vessel and the final transformation. Thorne wrote of becoming the living silver and achieving a state beyond mortality. His last entry, dated August 20th, 1887, just days before Catherine's disappearance, stated simply, "The girl will complete the circle. Her essence is the purest I have encountered, artist, dreamer, seeker. With her, the 7 will be complete, and I shall transcend. Silver to flesh, and flesh to silver. The eternal circuit closed at last." Despite these discoveries, no bodies were found in the mine or on the property. When confronted with the evidence, Thorne reportedly showed no emotion. According to Sheriff Conklin's statement, the Reverend simply said, "You cannot understand the work I do. Those souls were freely given, not taken." Judge Blackwood, overcome with rage at Thorne's calm demeanor, had to be physically restrained from attacking the preacher. "What have you done with my daughter?" he demanded repeatedly. According to Deputy Hayes' account, Thorne's response was cryptic. She rejected the gift freely offered to the others. She fled before the transformation could be completed, but the silver remembers her. It always will. Thorne was immediately arrested and held in the territorial prison to await trial. News of his arrest and the discoveries at the mine spread quickly through Santa Fe and beyond. The Santa Fe New Mexican published only a brief notice, stating that Reverend Thorne had been arrested in connection with several disappearances. The paper noted that, due to the sensitive and potentially disturbing nature of the case, further details are being withheld pending trial. This unusual restraint from the typically sensationalist frontier press has been attributed to editor Thomas Hughes's involvement with Thorne's church. Hughes's diary entries from this period reveal his inner conflict. "I cannot believe the accusations against the Reverend," he wrote, "yet I find myself unable to remove the amulet he gave me. When I try, my hands tremble, and a voice, not my own, yet somehow familiar, whispers that all will be made clear if I remain faithful. The silver grows warm against my skin when I think of betraying him." The community reaction was complex and divided. Court records indicate that while many were horrified by the allegations, a small group of Thorne's most devoted followers refused to believe the charges. In a petition submitted to the territorial governor, 12 members of his congregation claimed that Thorne was being persecuted for bringing true salvation to the frontier, and that the evidence had been fabricated by those who fear his message. Among the signatories was Margaret Bradford, the governor's wife, whose support placed her husband in an extraordinarily difficult position. Governor Bradford's private correspondence, preserved in the state archives, reveals his growing concern about his wife's mental state. Margaret speaks of the Reverend as though he were a prophet or even a Messiah, he wrote to a trusted advisor. She wears a silver pendant he gave her and refuses to remove it, even for sleep. When I suggested she might set it aside temporarily, she became hysterical, claiming it contained the blessing of a purified soul. I fear her mind has been poisoned by this man's influence. What happened next has been the subject of historical debate. On the night of September 17, 1887, a fire broke out in the territorial prison. In the ensuing chaos, Thorne escaped. Official reports claim that 3 guards died in the fire, though later investigation suggested that at least one had died from a slashed throat rather than smoke or flames. Witness accounts from surviving guards described unusual circumstances surrounding the fire. According to testimony given by guard Samuel Wilson, the fire appeared to start simultaneously in 3 separate locations, making it unlikely to have been accidental. More disturbing was his description of Thorne's behavior as the flames spread. He stood perfectly still in his cell, smiling as the fire approached, Wilson reported. I shouted for him to move away from the wall, but he acted as if he didn't hear me. Then, and I swear this on my mother's grave, the iron bars of his cell began to shimmer and bend like they were melting away. But the heat wasn't nearly intense enough for that. It was as if the metal was responding to him somehow. The manhunt for Silas Thorne became the largest in New Mexico Territory history. Wanted posters, preserved in the Smithsonian collection, offered a $500 reward for his capture, an enormous sum for the time. The posters described Thorne as armed and extremely dangerous and warned that he may be disguised as a common laborer or another man of the cloth. For 2 weeks, search parties combed the territory. Telegrams were sent to law enforcement officials as far away as Denver and El Paso. There were reported sightings from Albuquerque to Las Vegas, New Mexico, but none were confirmed. During this period, a disturbing pattern emerged among Thorne's former congregants. According to medical records from St. Vincent's Hospital, 8 individuals who had regularly attended his services were admitted with similar symptoms: fever, disorientation, and a mysterious silver rash that spread from the chest outward. In each case, the patient had been wearing a silver item given to them by Thorne. Doctors reported that these objects were unusually warm to the touch and appeared to be melting into the skin at the point of contact. Despite efforts to remove these items, they seemed to adhere to the flesh, causing severe damage when extraction was attempted. All 8 patients died within days of admission. The official cause of death was listed as unknown fever, but the attending physician's private notes, discovered in 1945, described a more disturbing end. The silver seems to consume them from within, spreading through the body like a malignancy. In the final stages, the skin takes on a metallic sheen, and the eyes cloud with what appears to be a silver film. The last patient, Mrs. Bradford, spoke continuously in her delirium of becoming the vessel and joining with the silver pathway. Her final words were not her own. The voice that emerged from her throat was masculine and utterly foreign to her nature. Then, on October 3rd, a stagecoach driver named William Porter reported picking up a passenger matching Thorne's description outside Los Cerrillos, a mining town south of Santa Fe. According to Porter's statement, the man was wearing miner's clothes but spoke with the refined accent associated with Thorne. Most notably, Porter observed that the passenger carried a heavy silver cross, partially concealed inside his shirt. He kept touching it while we rode, Porter reported, and I swear it seemed to move under his fingers, almost like it was liquid instead of solid. When I asked where he was headed, he smiled in a way that made my blood run cold and said he was going to complete a transformation long overdue. He spoke of Los Cerrillos as though he knew it well, particularly the old mines in the Ortiz Mountains. Porter's stage was bound for Cerrillos, but the passenger requested to be let off at a crossroads approximately 5 miles from town. Porter, who had seen the wanted posters, noted the location and reported it to authorities upon reaching Cerrillos. Sheriff Conklin immediately formed a posse and rode to the location. Tracking dogs picked up a scent leading toward the Ortiz Mountains, an area honeycombed with both active and abandoned mines. As darkness fell, the posse made camp with plans to continue at first light. According to multiple witness statements, shortly after midnight, the men were awakened by what they described as an unearthly wailing coming from the direction of the mountains. Deputy Hayes described it as the sound of a dozen souls in torment, rising and falling like no human voice I've ever heard. The sound continued for approximately 20 minutes before ceasing abruptly. Several members of the posse wanted to abandon the search, claiming the noise was a warning of supernatural danger. Sheriff Conklin, however, insisted they continue at first light, though he noted in his report that even the dogs seemed reluctant to proceed, whimpering and pulling at their leads as though sensing something beyond our understanding. Despite the unsettling experience, the posse continued their pursuit at dawn. They followed the tracks to the entrance of an abandoned mine known locally as La Luz, the Light. The mine had been operational briefly in the 1870s, but had been abandoned when several miners died in a collapse. Local folklore, documented years later by historian Maria Sandoval, held that La Luz had been named for a strange phenomenon reported by the original miners, a faint silvery glow that seemed to emanate from the deepest parts of the mine, visible only in absolute darkness. According to Sandoval's interviews with elderly residents, the miners had discovered an unusual vein of silver that shone with its own inner light and whispered to those who worked it. These claims were dismissed as superstition, but they took on new significance in light of subsequent events. The posse approached cautiously. The entrance showed signs of recent disturbance. Sheriff Conklin ordered 3 men to remain outside, while he, Hayes, and 2 others entered the mine. What transpired inside was documented only in their subsequent reports, as none of the 4 men ever spoke publicly about the experience after that day. According to the official report filed with the territorial governor, the search party found Thorne approximately 200 feet inside the mine. He had established what they described as a ritual space similar to that found at his church property. The walls were again marked with scripture written in blood mixed with silver dust. At the center of the chamber stood Thorne, surrounded by 7 silver vessels arranged in a perfect circle. Deputy Hayes's account provides additional details omitted from the official report, but included in his personal journal, discovered after his death in 1923. He described the chamber as illuminated by a light that had no visible source, a cold silver radiance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Thorne's breathing. The air, he wrote, was thick with the scent of metal and something else, something organic and deeply wrong, like the smell of a body long dead, yet somehow preserved. The report states that when confronted, Thorne made no attempt to flee or resist. Instead, he reportedly smiled and said, "You're too late. The transformation is complete. What was silver is now flesh, and what was flesh is now silver." When ordered to surrender, Thorne instead gestured to the 7 vessels surrounding him. "Do you not recognize them?" he asked. "Your neighbors, your friends, parts of them at least, the essential parts. The silver has preserved their essence, and now they will become something greater. We all will." According to Hayes's journal, at this point, one of the deputies attempted to approach Thorne, but stopped abruptly, crying out that the ground was moving. Hayes wrote, "The floor of the chamber appeared to ripple like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. From these ripples emerged what I can only describe as figures, human in general shape, but composed entirely of what appeared to be liquid silver. They rose like sleepwalkers, their features indistinct, save for hollow depressions where eyes should have been. I counted 5 such figures before chaos erupted." The official report describes what followed in more restrained terms. The suspect appeared to trigger some form of booby trap or chemical reaction that released toxic vapors into the chamber, causing disorientation and hallucinations among the search party. In the confusion, Deputy Williams discharged his weapon. Before the lawman could apprehend him, Thorne produced a vial containing a silvery liquid, which he consumed before they could intervene. Within moments, he began to convulse. Deputy Hayes's report describes what happened next. The prisoner's skin took on a metallic sheen, starting at his throat where he wore his silver cross, then spreading across his face and hands. He made no sound during this transformation, though his mouth opened as if in a silent scream. Within minutes, he had grown rigid, his skin appearing to harden and take on the luster of polished silver. Hayes's private journal offers a more disturbing account. No man should witness what became of Thorne. The silver cross he wore seemed to melt, flowing across his skin like quicksilver. His flesh absorbed it, transformed by it. For a moment, God help me, I could see both man and metal simultaneously, as though they occupied the same space. Then, the transformation accelerated. His eyes were the last to change, and in them I saw not pain, but ecstasy. When it was complete, what stood before us was Thorne's exact likeness cast in living silver. The figure took one step toward us before Deputy Williams emptied his revolver into it. The bullets struck the surface and were absorbed, creating ripples like stones thrown into water. Then the figure collapsed, not falling but flowing downward, returning to a pool of liquid silver that seeped into the earth and vanished. The official cause of death was recorded as poisoning by mercury compound, which was commonly used in silver mining and refining. The territorial medical examiner theorized that Thorne had created a concentrated mercury solution that caused rapid systemic failure. However, this clinical explanation does little to account for the statements of all four witnesses who maintained that Thorne's body had undergone some kind of transformation before their eyes. So disturbing was the sight that Sheriff Conklin ordered the mine sealed immediately, with Thorne's body left inside. Stone markers placed by the Territorial Survey Office indicate that the entrance was dynamited that same day. In the aftermath, authorities faced the difficult task of determining what had happened to Thorne's victims. Despite extensive searches, no bodies were ever recovered. The 7 silver vessels found with Thorne were taken as evidence and stored in the Territorial Courthouse. According to inventory records, each was approximately the size of a large drinking cup, ornately carved with biblical imagery, and filled with a substance described as silver amalgam of unusual composition. Deputy Hayes's journal provides a more detailed description that official reports omitted. Each vessel bears the likeness of one of the missing persons, he wrote. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, capturing not merely their features, but something of their essence. Gideon's youthful uncertainty, Donovan's grief-hardened gaze, Weiss's scholarly intensity. The silver surfaces seem to shift subtly when viewed from different angles, as though the faces are attempting to speak or express emotion. Most disturbing is the 7th vessel, which bears Catherine Blackwood's likeness, but appears incomplete somehow, the features blurred and indistinct compared to the others. Laboratory analysis conducted in Denver reported that the amalgam contained trace amounts of organic material, but the technology of the time could not determine its precise nature. The report simply noted that the material was inconsistent with known mineral compositions and recommended further study. The chemist who performed the analysis, Dr. Frederick Lansing, included a personal note with his official findings that was not made public until 1958. I have worked with metals for 30 years and have never encountered a substance with these properties, he wrote. The amalgam maintains a temperature approximately 2 degrees above ambient, regardless of external conditions. When placed near other silver objects, it appears to exert a subtle influence, causing them to tarnish in unusual patterns. Most troubling is its response to blood. When I accidentally cut my finger while examining one vessel, a drop fell onto the surface. The amalgam appeared to absorb the blood without leaving a trace, and for a brief moment I would swear the face carved into the vessel changed expression, from vacant to hungry. That study never took place. On December 21, 1887, a break-in occurred at the evidence room of the Territorial Courthouse. The only items taken were the 7 silver vessels. No suspects were ever identified, though rumors persisted that remaining members of Thorne's congregation were responsible. Judge Blackwood, still desperate for answers about his daughter, hired private investigators to track down the stolen vessels. Their reports, preserved in his personal papers, describe a frustrating search that led them to several former congregants who had fled Santa Fe after Thorne's death. Each denied involvement with the theft, but exhibited similar symptoms. They wore silver jewelry they refused to remove, spoke of carrying a blessing, and sometimes referred to themselves in the plural. One investigator, former Pinkerton detective James Morris, reported following Thomas Hughes, the newspaper editor, to a remote cabin in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in February 1888. Hughes has established what can only be described as a shrine, Morris wrote. The walls are covered with the same symbols found in Thorne's mine. He performs rituals involving silver dust and his own blood. When confronted, he claimed to be preserving the pathway until the silver shepherd returns to gather his flock. Most disturbing was his physical appearance. His skin has a grayish cast, and veins visible beneath the surface appear silver rather than blue. The case might have faded entirely from public memory had it not been for Catherine Blackwood. Unlike the other victims, Catherine reappeared in Santa Fe in January 1888, 3 months after Thorne's death. She was found wandering near the plaza, disoriented, and with no memory of where she had been. According to medical records, she was physically unharmed but in a state of profound shock. Dr. Walter Simmons, who treated Catherine upon her return, noted several unusual symptoms in his medical journal. "The patient exhibits a form of selective amnesia," he wrote. "She has no recollection of the period between her disappearance and return, yet retains all other memories intact. Physical examination reveals a peculiar mark at the base of her throat, a perfectly circular silver discoloration approximately 1 inch in diameter. Unlike a typical burn or brand, the mark has the appearance of silver that has somehow been infused into the skin itself. It remains cool to the touch, even when the surrounding skin is warm." In the weeks that followed, Catherine remained largely catatonic, responding to few stimuli and speaking only rarely. When she did speak, her words were recorded by her father in a journal that remained sealed until his death in 1912. The journal, now housed in the New Mexico Historical Society archives, contains disturbing fragments of Catherine's recollections. One entry from February 1888 reads, "Kay spoke today for nearly an hour, though much was incomprehensible. She described a silver room where Reverend T would draw out the light from people. She claims to have escaped when the process was interrupted. She spoke of others who were not so fortunate, describing them as empty vessels, waiting to be filled with something else. I fear her mind remains gravely disturbed." A later entry, dated March 10th, provides more coherent details. Kay described the ritual today with terrible clarity. She says T would have them drink from silver cups containing what he called the tears of saints, a metallic liquid that burned like fire. While they were weakened, he would make small cuts on their throats and press silver dust into the wounds. He spoke continually during this process, reciting texts that Kay says were like scripture but wrong somehow. The victims would grow progressively weaker with each session until they reached a state he called the emptying, after which they appeared alive but vacant, responding only to his commands. Perhaps most disturbing is the entry from April 3rd. Kay insisted on showing me something today. She filled a basin with water and dropped in the silver brooch T had given her, the one she had apparently left behind at the church on the night of her disappearance. As it touched the water, she began to tremble violently. The water in the basin grew cloudy, then seemed to take on a silvery sheen. Kay stared into it and began speaking in a voice not her own, deeper, masculine, with the refined accent I recall from my brief encounters with T. The voice said only, "The pathway remains open. Silver calls to silver. What has been begun cannot be undone." Kay collapsed immediately afterward and has not spoken since. Catherine never fully recovered. Judge Blackwood eventually sent her to a sanitarium in Colorado, where she remained until her death in 1923. Her death certificate lists the cause as consumption, but nursing records indicate she had been in physical decline for years, suffering from what one attending physician described as a wasting of the spirit rather than the body. The most haunting detail comes from the sanitarium's admission records. The intake form notes that Catherine arrived wearing a silver locket, not the one she had lost on the night of her disappearance, but a new one. Staff reported that she clutched it constantly and became hysterical when they attempted to remove it for examination. The description matches the silver vessels found in Thorne's mine. A face emerging from or submerging into the metal, the features caught in a moment of transformation. The face, according to the report, was Catherine's own. The Thorne case was officially closed following his death, though questions remained unanswered. What happened to the other victims? What was the nature of Thorne's rituals? And, perhaps most disturbing, what was in those silver vessels? In 1925, historian Jonathan Pierce attempted to research the case for a book on frontier justice. His inquiries met with resistance from local authorities and residents alike. In a letter to his publisher, Pierce wrote, "There remains an unspoken agreement in Santa Fe to leave the Thorne affair buried. Those old enough to remember changed the subject immediately. Younger generations have never heard the name. It is as if the community has collectively decided to forget." Pierce persisted, tracking down Robert Hayes, by then an elderly man living in Colorado. Hayes refused an interview, but sent a brief handwritten note that read, "Some doors should remain closed. Some knowledge is too heavy to carry. I have not spoken of what I saw in that mine for nearly 40 years, and I will take those memories to my grave. I suggest you do the same with your research." Undeterred, Pierce continued his investigation, focusing on locating any surviving members of Thorne's congregation. His notes indicate that he managed to identify 17 individuals who had regularly attended services at the church. Of these, 12 had died under unusual circumstances in the decade following Thorne's death. The remaining 5 had relocated to various parts of the country. After months of correspondence, Pierce arranged to meet with Eleanor Hughes, the widow of newspaper editor Thomas Hughes, who was living in a boarding house in Denver. His journal entry following this meeting reveals a disturbing encounter. Mrs. H. agreed to speak with me only on condition that I not record or publish certain details. She appears much younger than her 68 years would suggest, with only a few strands of gray in her otherwise dark hair. Most striking are her eyes, which have an unusual silvery quality to the irises. She spoke of her husband's involvement with Thorne's church with obvious reluctance. T.H. had been given one of what she called the blessed vessels, a small silver amulet containing what Thorne claimed was the distilled essence of a purified soul. According to Mrs. H., her husband wore this amulet constantly and would often engage in one-sided conversations with it, as though the object were speaking to him. And when I asked about the silver vessels found with Thorne, she became agitated and insisted they were not mere objects, but dwelling places that were neither fully empty nor fully occupied. She claimed that Thorne had discovered a method of extracting and preserving human consciousness, using silver as a conduit. Most disturbing was her assertion that Thorne himself had not truly died in that mine. "The silver remembers," she told me. "It holds his pattern, his essence. The vessels were scattered as he instructed, placed with those who would protect them until the time of gathering." When I pressed her for a clarification, she smiled in a way that made my blood run cold and said, "Silver calls to silver, Mr. Pierce. The pathway remains open. One day he will return to walk it again." Pierce abandoned the project shortly thereafter. His research notes, donated to the University of New Mexico Library in 1963, contain one final cryptic entry: "Dreams of silver faces, the same each night now, watching, waiting. I understand Hayes's warning too late." The historian's personal physician noted that in his final weeks, Pierce had developed an unusual condition, a metallic discoloration spreading across his chest from a central point where, the doctor observed, he had begun wearing a silver pendant of unknown origin. Pierce refused to discuss or remove the item. Pierce died of an apparent stroke 3 weeks later. The attending physician noted that the body exhibited unusual characteristics during examination, including blood with a silvery sheen and skin that maintained a curious rigidity hours after death should have relaxed the muscles. The silver pendant was not found among his effects. The abandoned church property where Thorne once preached was eventually reclaimed by the desert. By 1900, little remained but crumbling adobe walls. The mine shaft on the property was permanently sealed during a WPA project in 1937, though no mention of its history appears in the work orders. Local residents avoided the area for decades. Pablo Hernandez, interviewed by folklorist Richard Martinez in 1958, explained the unwritten rule. The old ones taught us to stay away from the preacher's place. They say the ground there is sick, poisoned by what happened. Nothing grows right. Plants come up twisted or with silver streaks in the leaves. Animals won't graze there. At night, if the moon is full, they say you can sometimes see the ground ripple like water and hear voices singing from deep below. As for the mine where Thorne died, Laloux's territorial survey maps from 1890 no longer showed its location. When researcher Maria Sandoval attempted to find it in 1962 as part of a comprehensive study of historical mining sites, local guides claimed no knowledge of its existence. Sandoval's field notes express frustration. Locals clearly know something about the site, but refuse to discuss it. One elderly man crossed himself when I mentioned the name Laloux's and walked away mid-conversation. After weeks of research, Sandoval believed she had identified the approximate location based on old mining claims and geographical landmarks. Her journal describes what happened when she attempted to visit the site. The area is unnaturally silent, no birds, no insects. The soil has a strange quality, fine-grained and slightly metallic to the touch. I found what appears to be the collapsed entrance to a mine shaft marked only by a circular depression in the earth and the remains of stone markers. As I began taking photographs, I experienced an intense sensation of being watched. The air seemed to thicken, making breathing difficult. Most disturbing was what happened to my equipment. My compass began spinning erratically, and my silver jewelry, a bracelet and ring, grew uncomfortably warm against my skin. Under microscopic examination, the soil contains an unusually high concentration of silver particles with properties I've never encountered. They appear to be in constant motion when observed under certain light conditions, arranging themselves into patterns reminiscent of the symbols described in the Thorne case files. Sandoval abandoned her research shortly after this visit, citing personal reasons. Her soil samples, stored at the University of New Mexico Geology Department, were reported missing in 1965. When I attempted to remove the ring, I found it had somehow tightened, leaving a perfect circular mark when I finally managed to pull it free. I collected soil samples from the site for analysis, but these proved even more perplexing. The technician who last handled them was treated for unusual burns on his hands, which he described as feeling like the skin was being replaced by something else, something cold and heavy. The final documented connection to the Thorne case came in 1966, when construction workers excavating for a new building foundation in Santa Fe unearthed a small silver vessel matching the description of those associated with Thorne. According to the contractor's report filed with the city, the object was turned over to local authorities. However, police records contain no mention of the discovery, and the vessel's current whereabouts remain unknown. Joseph Mendoza, one of the construction workers present at the discovery, gave a statement to local newspaper The New Mexican that was never published. The reporter's notes, discovered during research for this documentary, record Mendoza's description. It was like a small cup, but the outside was carved with a face, a man's face, that seemed to be pushing out from inside the silver. When Rodriguez picked it up, he said it felt warm, like it had been sitting in the sun, though it had been buried deep in the cold ground. The foreman took it from him and said he'd turn it in to the police. Rodriguez got sick that night, fever, confusion. He kept saying he could hear someone whispering to him, telling him to come back for the cup. By morning, his skin had this grayish tint to it. They took him to the hospital, but he was gone before sundown. The reporter who took this statement, Michael Collins, apparently attempted to follow up on Mendoza's claims. His notes indicate that he visited Rodriguez's widow, who showed him a strange, circular mark on her husband's chest, a silver discoloration that the hospital staff had been unable to explain. Collins also tried to locate the foreman who had taken possession of the vessel, only to discover the man had abruptly left Santa Fe, leaving no forwarding address. Collins drafted an article titled "Echoes of a Forgotten Horror: The Thorne Legacy," but it never ran. The editor's rejection note simply stated, "Some stories are better left untold. Trust me on this, Mike." Collins resigned from the paper 2 weeks later. His subsequent whereabouts are unknown. In the years since, the case has been largely forgotten. Occasional references appear in scholarly works on frontier justice or the history of the New Mexico Territory, but these are typically brief and lacking in detail. The sealed records were eventually transferred to the state archives, where they remained largely untouched until being partially declassified in 1952 for historical research. Yet traces of Thorne's influence continue to surface in unexpected ways. In 1978, a jeweler in Albuquerque reported an unusual commission. An elderly woman requested a silver pendant crafted to exact specifications, matching the description of Thorne's original vessels. When questioned about the design's origin, she claimed it had come to her in a dream where a man with silver skin had shown her the pathway between worlds. The jeweler, unsettled by the conversation, declined the commission. 1 week later, his shop was broken into, though nothing was taken except his silver working tools. In 1985, a graduate student researching territorial history discovered a previously uncatalogued collection of letters written by Elena Montoya, whose brother Felipe had been among Thorne's victims. The letters, spanning the period from 1888 to 1915, document Elena's lifelong search for answers. In her final letter, written just days before her death, she described a disturbing encounter. "I dreamed of Felipe last night, but it was not truly him. His skin was silver, his eyes empty pools. He said they have been gathering, drawn together by something stirring in the deep places. The silver shepherd calls his flock. The vessels are nearly full again. What begins in silver ends in silver, and the circle never truly closes." What truly happened in Santa Fe during those months in 1887 may never be fully understood. The facts we can verify are these: a preacher arrived, people disappeared, and something in an abandoned silver mine terrified hardened lawmen so deeply that they sealed it away and refused to speak of it again. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case lies not in what we know, but in what remains hidden. Of the 7 silver vessels Thorne created, 6 are still unaccounted for. And of the individuals who disappeared under his influence, only Catherine Blackwood ever returned, forever changed by whatever she experienced. The abandoned mines of the Ortiz Mountains remain to this day, though many have been sealed or have collapsed over time. Local hikers occasionally report hearing unusual sounds emanating from the deeper canyons, what some describe as singing or wailing, that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Park Ranger David Salazar, who has worked in the area for over 20 years, has compiled reports of strange phenomena that he shares only reluctantly. "We've had multiple incidents of visitors experiencing disorientation and lost time near certain mine sites," he explained in a rare interview. They report following what they describe as silver trails through the underbrush, only to find themselves miles from where they intended to be with no memory of how they got there. Most troubling are the physical effects. Several hikers have developed unusual metallic discolorations on their skin after these experiences, perfect circles that medical professionals cannot explain. Salazar himself wears gloves at all times, but declined to discuss why. When pressed, he would say only, "There are things in these mountains that don't belong to our world, things that were called here long ago and never properly sent away. The old Hispanic families know. They've passed down warnings through generations. Don't follow lights in the abandoned mines. Don't pick up silver objects found in the dirt. And never, ever wear silver jewelry while hiking these trails. In 1969, the last known person connected to the case, Martha Whitfield's granddaughter Eleanor, passed away in an Albuquerque nursing home. According to staff records, in her final days, she became increasingly agitated, repeatedly trying to remove something from around her neck that wasn't there. Her last coherent words, recorded by the attending nurse, were, "He's calling us back. All who wore his silver. He's found a way to return." 1 week after Eleanor's death, the nursing home reported a break-in. The only item missing was a small silver cross that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother, a gift, family records noted, from Reverend Silas Thorne. The nurse who had attended Eleanor during her final days, Rebecca Martinez, resigned her position shortly after the break-in. In a letter to her supervisor, she wrote, "I cannot explain what I saw the night before Eleanor died. The silver cross she kept by her bedside seemed to move of its own accord, sliding across the table toward her as she slept. When I picked it up, intending to return it to the drawer, it was unnaturally warm, and for a moment, God forgive me for saying this, I thought I saw a face in the metal, watching me. I know how this sounds, but I swear on my mother's grave that what I've written is true." I cannot return to that place. Martinez relocated to Arizona, where she lived in relative seclusion until her death in 1994. Among her personal effects was a journal documenting what she described as visitations, dreams in which she was approached by figures with silver skin who showed her the pathway between worlds and promised that the transformation would be painless if freely accepted. The final entry, dated 3 days before her death, reads simply, "I understand now. Silver to flesh and flesh to silver. The circle nears completion." In 2007, a construction project in downtown Santa Fe uncovered the remains of what historians believe was Thorne's original church. Archaeological excavations revealed a hidden chamber beneath the altar area, containing evidence of unusual rituals. Soil samples showed high concentrations of silver and organic material, later identified as human blood. Most disturbing was the discovery of 7 small niches in the chamber walls, each sized perfectly to hold one of the silver vessels described in historical accounts. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Sarah Hernandez, reported unusual difficulties throughout the excavation, equipment malfunctions, unexplained illnesses among the crew, and most troublingly, the disappearance of several artifacts from the secured storage facility. Items containing silver would simply vanish overnight, she noted in her final report. Security cameras experienced interference at specific times, showing only static during the periods when items went missing. The excavation was abruptly terminated when 3 crew members developed identical symptoms, circular silver marks on their skin, followed by fever and disorientation. The site was filled in and paved over within weeks, the project abandoned despite significant financial investment. When questioned about this decision, city officials cited environmental concerns but declined to elaborate. Some doors, it seems, can never be fully closed. Some secrets refuse to remain buried. And in the high desert of New Mexico, where the wind carries whispers across time, perhaps some transformations are still unfolding, silver to flesh and flesh to silver, in an alchemy of horror that continues to this day. In 2017, metallurgist Dr. James Reeves, researching historic silver mining techniques, received an anonymous package containing what appeared to be a sample of silver ore from the Ortiz Mountains. His analysis revealed properties that defied conventional explanation. The sample maintained a temperature slightly above ambient, regardless of environmental conditions, and under certain light conditions appeared to exhibit microscopic movement, independent of external forces. Most unsettling was what happened when Reeves accidentally exposed the sample to his own blood during a laboratory accident. In his sealed research notes, he described watching as the silver absorbed the organic material, not as a porous substance might, but actively, like a living organism consuming nutrients. The sample subsequently changed composition developing structures that, under microscopic examination, resembled cellular tissue. Reeves discontinued his research shortly thereafter, citing ethical concerns. Colleagues reported he had begun wearing a silver pendant of unusual design and had grown increasingly withdrawn. His current whereabouts are unknown. When you walk the streets of Old Santa Fe, look closely at the silver jewelry in shop windows and around the necks of passers-by. Is it merely reflecting light, or is there something within it watching? Something that waits and remembers, and someday might awaken once more. The territorial records tell us that 7 vessels were created, each containing what Thorne called the essence of a victim. 6 remain unaccounted for, scattered perhaps among unwitting owners who feel strangely compelled to keep them close, to wear them always, to listen to their whispers in the dark hours of night. And somewhere perhaps the silver pathway remains open, a doorway between states of being that was opened in 1887 and never properly closed, a doorway through which something still watches and waits and calls to those who wear its gifts. As for Thorne himself, the official record states he died in that mine, his body never recovered. But those who have studied the case most deeply harbor other suspicions. As Catherine Blackwood whispered to her father in a rare moment of lucidity, he found a way to become the silver, to exist within it. As long as his vessels remain scattered like seeds across the land, he remains too, fragmented, but aware, patient, and eternal. The silver remembers, and in its cold, reflective depths, something looks back at us still,